So we left off with a brief introduction to anatomy and some of the anatomical ideas and evidence that Charles Darwin was looking into. The slides that I'm going to show you next actually come from a book called Your Inner Fish, which is a really interesting book. It's a very easy to read book, and there's actually a 3-part TV series. On Your Inner Fish includes the author that I've given you a link to in the week's schedule. So I would encourage you, if you have some time, to watch that 3-part series to get a lot more details on this. The bottom line is, anatomically speaking, the cell structure of all living organisms is basically the same. So your cells are essentially the same as a yeast cell and the same as the kinds of cells that you would find in an oyster or a jellyfish. The cell structure is basically the same in everything. If we look at what we would consider to be the higher order animals, embryos of mammals, birds, reptiles are all very similar. Going through very similar stages, and we could put amphibians in there as well. And we're going to look specifically at some things called homologous organs, which are organs that are similar in different organisms but have but can have different functions. If we look at the fin of a fish, the fin or the foreleg of a reptile, and this thing up here in between the fish and the reptile is kind of a transitional organism. If we look at the forelimb of different mammals, including humans and dogs, we see a very similar structure. You have a large bone, 2 skinny bones, and then a bunch of little bones at the end. And you can see theropod dinosaur, a seal, a bird's wing, a pterosaur, which is a kind of a flying reptile, a lizard, a penguin, a bat, and even a humpback whale have a very common type of set of structures in your bones. This is the skeleton of a modern whale. One of the interesting things you can see on this skeleton is its fin. So you can see there's the big bone, the 2 thinner, longer bones, and then all of the finger bones and the wrist bones. The other interesting thing that we find on a whale is what we call a vestigal organ. Whales have hip bones. This is all they have. It's toward their tail. There are occasions when a whale will grow like tiny back legs. But these are hip bones, and they're considered vestigial organs because they really don't serve any function in a modern whale. So there's another view of those hip bones. And then this is the organism called Tiktaalik, which is considered a transitional organism between fish and the very earliest tetrapod, which is a 4-legged animal that walks on land. You are technically a tetrapod. You have 4 legs or 4 limbs. And Tiktaalik is our transitional organism. And so Your Inner Fish was written by one of the researchers that discovered Tiktaalik. And if you want to see a reproduction in a fossil of Tiktaalik, you can go to the Field Museum in Chicago when it reopens. So that's what these slides are about. They're kind of showing the relationship between fins and forelimbs and how that transition works. And there is a fossil fin that they found. This is the front leg of Tiktaalik. So this is a kind of a transitional fish. This is from a transitional fish earlier than Tiktaalik, and this is Tiktaalik's forelimb. The other evidence that we have that's very, very strong, and this is like the one piece that Darwin did not have, was genetics. Darwin didn't know anything about DNA or RNA, and so this was a huge test for the whole concept of evolution, that all life is related, because if the genes aren't the same, then the idea that things are related would pretty much have been thrown out the door. But it turns out that everything is very similar. The structure of the DNA and the RNA is the same in all living organisms. This is one of the reasons why a virus can take over your cell and use it to reproduce its DNA. And this is an example, again, from that book, Your Inner Fish, that just shows the relationship between the DNA and the formation of different parts of your body. And you can see that the DNA that controls the development of parts of your body is the same as the DNA that controls the parts of a fly's body, and it even controls parts in the same location. So it just shows you kind of how closely DNA is tied between different, very, very, very different organisms. So how do we put this all together? In my historical geology class, we do something called cladistic analysis. We're not going to do that in here, but it's a way to statistically analyze all these similarities that we've been discussing. And it indicates how strong the affinity is, or the relationship is, between different organisms and different species. So when we bring all this together, the conclusion is the characteristics of populations of living organisms have changed through time. Life has become more complex. It has become more diverse. And that third bullet is kind of the key thing in organic evolution. All life is related. And this is not even considered theoretical anymore. It's simply accepted as a factual observation. And it becomes the basis for everything from using dissecting cats in the laboratory and using animals as an analog for understanding human health and human behavior. And so I think there was a researcher that once said biology doesn't really make any sense unless you understand organic evolution. So we're going to kind of skip past the evolutionary trends. There's a slide here that mentions missing links. We have found many, many, many links between fossil species and living species. And yet every time we find one, it kind of opens up a gap between the one that we found and the two that it was filling in the space between. So filling in a gap actually creates two new gaps. So it's kind of a silly argument against evolution because it doesn't work very well. And we have found many, many, many transitional organisms. So the question that then comes up is, if all life is related, what is the mechanism that resulted in this evolution? And so Darwin is, after he returns on the voyage, he gets married, he's raising his family, and he's what would be considered a gentleman farmer. So he doesn't do the actual getting his hands dirty type work. He directs the work around the farm. And one of the things that he notices is that if you look at a population of organisms on a farm, even when they're the same species, they display a very wide variety of characteristics. Some of those characteristics might be useful, some are not useful. And today we know that that variety is reflected in an organism's genes. And we also know where those new genes come from. They're produced by mutation, duplication, genetic exchange, symbiotic relationships. There are a number of ways that you can get new genes. And really it's this ability of life to mutate and come up with new genes that is causing us problems with this COVID virus right now. Once those new genes exist, they're passed to offspring during reproduction, assuming that reproduction actually occurs. So we have this wide variety of traits. They're inheritable, and this kind of shows you what can happen if a gene, for example, duplicates. Instead of one finger or one digit on this wing, you can get two. So, what does Darwin observe, and what's the core idea in natural selection? Well, what Darwin observes on the farm is that domesticated plants and animals are bred to favor certain characteristics. Essentially, what we do with domesticated organisms is if we see a characteristic we like, we'll breed two members of the species that have that characteristic. And it makes it more likely that their offspring will have that characteristic as well. If you look out into nature, what you can see is that nature is able to do that as well. The natural environment also provides opportunities and stresses for living organisms and can also select for characteristics that are favorable, that allow an organism to be more successful in an ecological niche. The biggest difference between the artificial environment or the barnyard environment and the natural environment is that when humans do selection, we can fence off the animals from each other, and we can make it happen in a smaller number of generations. In the natural environment, it typically takes longer because while a favorable characteristic might make it more likely for an organism to survive and reproduce, it doesn't necessarily cut off all of the others. So these are some slides that kind of show the development and why having any kind of an eye would be favorable. You can see a limpet, which is a very kind of a simple organism and has a simple kind of an eye, can still get an advantage from being able to see with that eye. So what happens in nature is that populations of a species can become isolated. When that happens, selection can happen a little bit more quickly. The equivalent on the barnyard side is to put the cows inside a fence and not let them reproduce unless we actually want them to. So nature can actually occasionally set up a barrier. Sometimes those barriers are geographic. So a mountain range from plate tectonics could grow up over time. A flock of birds can get blown over to an island and then can't get mixed in with other birds of their species again. But it can also be, it can also occur just because of certain behaviors. So the birds that like a certain type of bush or shrub may not mix up and reproduce with other birds of their species if those other birds are taking advantage of some different kind of food source. So the conclusion of all of this is that the natural environment provides conditions that result in the evolution through the process of natural selection. Populations of organisms display variety as a result of genetic change, and organisms with favorable characteristics for their ecological niche are more likely to thrive and reproduce, while organisms with unfavorable characteristics are less likely to thrive and reproduce. And you can see how just a slight genetic change can result in a virus that just spreads across the planet because that little change made it easier for it to jump from one human into another. Over time, favorable characteristics can accumulate in a population until members of that population can no longer reproduce with the population or the species from which they became isolated. And at that point, you have a new species and you have the origin of all of these different types of finches that Darwin found.